thank you for joining us in this garden today so that we can hear and listen to the wonderful message that we have found in Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33. And let's read that for us today. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat was being battered by waves and was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But he noticed the strong wind, and he became frightened, and he began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got to the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Mike, what do you think about that scripture today?
Ben, it's actually one of my favorites. A comedian said he was in a shoe store recently trying on a new pair of sneakers. I buy one pair a year. He said to the sales clerk, "It's too tight." And she said, "Try it with the tongue out." So he said, It's no good, it's still too tight." I know it's a bad joke, but it's where I wanted to go today. If you're in fashion or in the social media, then you probably know that the market for sneakers and athletic shoes is huge. Just a couple of years ago, the global sneaker market reached $62.8 billion. Sneakers make a major fashion statement these days. The most fashionable sneakers, of course, are the ones that are designed by or for athletes or celebrities. And notable figures even help to design their high-end sneakers to appeal to their fan base. But maybe you didn't hear about the sneakers that came out in 2019. They were designed for the ultimate celebrity of all, Jesus, Son of God. You heard me right. Last year, a pair of sneakers, of designer sneakers, created a whole new, different kind of fashion statement when they bought a pair of Nike Air Max 97s and redesigned them as Jesus shoes. The Jesus shoes came with little golden crucifixes hanging from the laces and pockets of holy water from the Jordan River, supposedly, that had been prayed over by a priest. And the designers claim that they made the shoes to mock the idea of shoe companies partnering with celebrities, and who's a bigger celebrity than Jesus himself? So Daniel Greenberg, one of the designers behind the Jesus shoes, said, "We ask ourselves, what would a shoe collaboration with Jesus look like? And obviously, it should let you walk on water." Well, how can you do that, they asked. Well, you pump this holy water into the pocket of a pair of these Air Max 97s, and with the water underneath the sole, you get Jesus shoes, you're walking on water. It's the holiest collaboration ever, and the Jesus shoes sold for a mere $1,425. That's $1,425 for a pair of sneakers. So I guess we can close our Bibles and go home right now.
Sounds good.
Now that we know the secret to walking on water, we can listen to Mark's selection and have that second cup of coffee or recline for our Sunday naps in our recliner. Just kidding, of course. Our text for today is about Peter trying and ultimately failing to walk on water, but it's about so much more than that. Because the most important thing to notice in this morning's Bible passage isn't that Jesus walked on water or that Peter took at least a few baby steps on the Sea of Galilee. The important thing to notice is that Peter got out of the boat in the first place. Peter trying to walk on water is a perfect image of what it means to become a follower of Christ. It's the perfect image of what it means to commit your life to Him. Notice that all the disciples were in the boat, but only Peter took that step of faith to go to Jesus. I'm really glad to know that you're continuing to log in for church on Sundays. or whenever you choose to join our service, because people choose to attend our virtual worship for a lot of different reasons. We're thrilled that you've chosen to engage with Hurstbourne Christian Church. We hope you experience the presence of God while you're here. We hope you find what you're looking for. And some of you may have tuned into worship today mainly to appease a family member. Maybe some of you logged in out of curiosity or a feeling of guilt over not being able to get to in-person services during the pandemic. Some of you came because in these days of every day looking like every other day, you're looking for some kind of normal schedule. We may be missing friendships or needing hope or looking for comfort. All good reasons. And as much as we want to, just joining us in virtual church isn't going to answer your questions or heal your hurts or change your life. Committing our lives to serving Jesus, on the other hand, will make a difference in how we experience life and how we get through this pandemic together. As I said, I'm thrilled that you logged into worship today. I pray with all my heart that today's service brings us all closer to the Master. That's what we're all looking for, really, for even if we're not aware of it, that's what we're looking for. And that's what Peter was looking for, too. Ben, what do you think Peter learned as he tried to walk on water to reach Jesus that day?
Well, I'd say he probably learned a fair amount. This story brings up a lot of different feelings, and especially fear. Because when he made those baby steps and he was out there, he got scared and kind of got a little bit turned around. Even when there's nothing really to be scared about. Our minds are good about that, about creating something out of nothing. And I actually have a bit of a story to tell about that. A few nights ago, I was sleeping and I heard a noise out in the kitchen. And it was a loud jump, and I moved my arm, but my arm was underneath Miranda. So I jumped up and I pulled my arm out of socket, and it still hurts today.
I know a good doctor.
You know a good doctor. Hopefully I don't need to get it replaced. But I went out after pulling my arm and having it hurt and pain to see my cat had knocked over something on the counter. My mind had come up with the idea that this noise was a robber, a monster, anything. But it was nothing. But this nothing hurt me. It caused me pain. But it wasn't the nothing that hurt me, but it was my reaction to what wasn't there. I was fine until I did something. If I just stayed in bed and not really moved, I'd be okay and my shoulder wouldn't be hurting right now. But because I did something when I didn't need to do anything, when I was safe already, I was caused in pain, which is a lot like our story today. I mean, if you hear someone jump at nothing, you might hear someone say, "Oh, why'd you jump? It was just the wind." I mean, you can't see the wind. You can see the things that wind blows. You can see the leaves, the trees, all the things the wind is doing, but you can't see the wind itself. It's invisible. It's not there. And with Peter, everything got started out well until he got spooked by the wind, something that he couldn't even see. But he got scared that this wind was moving things around him. He couldn't see what was happening, but he got frightened, even though the wind does nothing. And when he got frightened, he fell into the water. His reaction is what caused him the pain, not what he was fearful to begin with. And we've all been in that sort of situation, scared of something that's really nothing and can't hurt us. Now, I'm not talking about the virus. The virus is something we can't see, but it can hurt us. But that doesn't mean everything's that way. I mean, who at school hasn't been scared to take a test once in a while? And maybe your fear of the test makes you actually perform worse on the test than you would have if you hadn't been scared of it. Or especially when you go in for a job interview. It's such a stressful moment. If you're fearful and nervous, you're not going to perform well. And most definitely the fear of rejection, especially when you're maybe asking someone out on a date for the first time. Maybe you're scared that they're going to say no. So you never asked them in the first place, which means you end up getting rejected. Your fear of something that's going to happen makes it come true. Maybe you have a fear of starting a new hobby even, but you say, I'm a little too old and old dogs can't learn new tricks. So you don't start the hobby, and the thing you're fearful of becomes true. Fear holds us back when there's nothing that should hold us back. With Jesus, we can walk on water. We can do something extraordinary if we have the faith to do it. If we know Jesus is with us, then what is holding us back? Why do we let invisible things come into our lives and cause us so much fear? Jesus, just like with Peter, is there to pick us up when something goes wrong. We will make mistakes. I know I have, and I think Mike may have made one or two.
More than my share.
But that doesn't mean it needs to be the end. That's only the beginning. As we make baby steps out with faith, much like Peter, we can overcome all. Now, I think I'm going to hand it over to Gat and see if he has a little more to talk about with this scripture today.
Ben, that's a beautiful interpretation. The first thing we can learn, I think, from Peter's story is to come to Jesus even when we've got those unanswered questions. If you're holding off on making a decision to follow Jesus until you read that one article or sit in that one discussion that answers all your questions about the life of faith, then you're never going to get out of the boat. It's never going to happen. Nobody has all the answers. I've recently reflected more on my own mortality, and that's not morbid, that's just realizing how old I am, I guess, Ben. But Jerry Kramer is former offensive lineman with the Green Bay Packers, and he played under legendary coach Vince Lombardi. Jerry Kramer has a couple of books about his life with the Packers and his life as a sports commentator afterwards. In his book called Distant Replay, Kramer reflected on his own mortality. He confessed that even though at the time of the writing of his book he was in the best of health, he had begun to think about death a lot. It must be part of the aging thing, I guess. But Kramer reveals that when his father died, it hit him really hard, that it was hard on his whole family. And Kramer writes, "I think his death was more difficult for the family than it was for my father. Dad was a very religious man. He was ready to go. He had his faith, and he said he was locked in the arms of the Lord. And sometimes I wish I had that kind of faith," Jerry Kramer continued, "but I don't. I just have questions." Now, I respect Jerry Kramer's honesty. I expect anyone who confronts and wrestles with the questions of faith. An unexamined, untested faith can't stand up in the storms of life. The truth is that Jesus left his disciples behind with unanswered questions, and he did it deliberately. He wanted us to trust him with our lives without absolute proof of his existence. He wanted us to draw us to God with love and not compel us by force or fear. He wanted us to have the free will to choose to follow him or not follow him. But let me tell you about a man named John C. Wright. Wright's a former lawyer and award-winning science fiction writer, and at one time he was a committed atheist. One day in the middle of wrestling with some questions and doubts, he prayed a really honest prayer. This is what he said. He prayed, "Dear God, I know that you do not exist. Nonetheless, as a scholar, I'm forced to entertain the hypothetical possibility that I am mistaken." And now there's a scientist with humility and integrity. And John C. Wright went on to ask God to reveal himself to him in some way. He decided that if the prayer went unanswered, then he could safely assume God didn't exist, or at least didn't care enough to reveal himself. If the prayer went unanswered, all he would lose is a little bit of his own dignity. If it was answered, all the world would open up to him. But soon afterwards, God did answer John C. Wright's prayer. As Wright explains it, something from beyond the reach of time and space, more fundamental than reality, reached across the universe and broke into my soul and changed me. I was altered down to the root of my being. It was like falling in love. John C. Wright's prayer sounds to me like Peter's failed experiment at water walking. Wright wasn't sure even that God existed, but he was willing to move forward in spite of the questions. And that tiny act of faith, that baby step, John C. Wright met God and found new life. The first thing we need to learn from Peter's story is to come to Jesus even if we've got unanswered questions. The second thing we need to learn from Peter's story is to come to Jesus even if we're in the middle of a storm. Notice that this scene takes place in the middle of a storm. Matthew says the boat was buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. It would be remarkable for Peter to try to walk on the waves if the sea was calm that day. But to do it in the middle of a storm is even more remarkable. Life has its storms, doesn't it? We're in one. How do you respond to a storm? The other 11 disciples took shelter in the boat. Only Peter believed that it was better to brave the storm with Jesus than to stay in the boat without him. So that's what he decided to do. I used to love the whitewater raft back when I had two good shoulders. But I used to love the and Ocoee River was my favorite. The 13th trip down the Ocoee River that I made, we came to a new rapid. It seems that part of the hillside had broken loose that year and come down because of ice storms and fallen into the river and therefore created a new rapid. It was called Taco Hole. And so the guide that was with us and our people in the raft said, do you all want to go the safe way around or do you want to go right through the dead center? I said, we didn't pay you for a safe trip. We paid you for adventure. We want to experience this rapid at its peak. He said, okay. So we went right through the middle. And when we got to the middle of that rapid, we realized why it was called Taco Hole. It bent our raft in two like a taco. Just bent it up, knocked everybody out of the raft, including the guide. The raft is empty now. We're in the water. You know, that's risky when you do that. And I found myself in this passage from Peter when he finally reached out and Jesus grabbed him. That's the position I was in, underneath the empty raft, unable to get up to the surface of the water, realizing that you have a hydraulic in there that kicks you around and throws you out. If you wait for it to throw you out, that's when you reach and try to get out of the rapid. I did that, but I came up underneath the raft. There was no getting out. It took me back into the hydraulic a second time, and I kicked and came out and reached, and I was under the raft still. Now I'm running out of wind. I'm not the greatest swimmer, and I'm out of air, and I'm thinking, okay, this is the end. One more time, and I kicked as I came out, and I felt that grab. Somebody grabbed my arm and pulled me to the surface. It was relief. The other raft had come in behind ours and was picking up the survivors, basically. So glad to get that breath of fresh air. And I can just understand how Peter must have felt over that. But the important part of it is we risk something. And to risk, you've got to get out of your comfort zone. God calls us in the church out beyond our comfort zones of the still and stagnant waters. God calls us to follow God into the churning rapids of the world's needs and to make a difference with our lives. Many of us wait to make a decision about how seriously we take the call to follow Jesus. We decide to wait until we're older, or we wait until we have kids, or we wait until we get our heads straight. We'll wait until we're not so busy. We'll wait until we feel a little more worthy, or until we get our spiritual act together, until this storm passes. We'll wait until this COVID stuff is over. And that's when we'll make a decision about Jesus, when things aren't so crazy. Here's the problem. There's always going to be storms. No matter what your friends post on Instagram or Facebook, many of them are experiencing their own storms right now. And that fact will never change. But if Jesus really is the Son of God, if Jesus really is the way, the truth, and the life, then isn't the purpose of our life found in facing our storms with Him? So don't let unanswered questions stand between you and Jesus. That's what faith is all about. And don't let the storms of life stand between you and Jesus. The final thing we need to learn from Peter's story is that to not let anything stand between ourselves and Jesus. You know, Peter almost made it. He took those first few baby steps of faith, and then he let fear and circumstances overwhelm him. We can't stand in judgment of Peter. We do the same thing. We start to get out of the boat, and then doubt intercedes, or we're afraid of looking foolish, or we let our busy schedules interfere. And then we let fear, as Ben reminds us, we let fear overcome us. What would Peter have experienced if he'd made it all the way to Jesus? Imagine the abundant life he could have begun experiencing that very moment if he really trusted Jesus. Maybe Peter wouldn't have denied Christ later on if he completed that walk that day. Don't know. But think for a moment. What does Jesus have in store for you if you commit your whole life completely to Him? What's holding you back? This week, Facebook is a wonderful thing. This week I got a call from a basketball player that I have not heard from or seen in 30 years. He reached out on the messenger and said that he was going through a tough time, that he had been in the Army. He came back with PTSD, he'd served in combat zones, and was having a really rough time of it. And his VA counselor told him to reach out to somebody he trusted. How humbling it is that I was the one he chose. He said, "Coach, I've always trusted you more than anybody." And he began to relate part of his life, and he said he's met a wonderful woman who's helping him get through and has become his anchor. He then shared the young lady's name with me, and I realized she's the daughter of former members of my church in Somerset. Her father, David P., I'll just call him by his last initial, had contracted cancer, and it was in his mouth. And through several surgeries, David's whole face had been removed. It was a frightening thing to even sit and be with Dave because of how conformed and contorted his face had become as they rebuilt it after the cancer. The cancer was still there. He got it from dipping tobacco, so he was struggling mightily with that diagnosis. And I began to visit with him on occasion in his home and share faith with him because David had never made a commitment. He confessed to me that he always believed in God, but he didn't think his life was good enough to earn his way into heaven, and he was afraid that God would reject him. So David believed he didn't have the right connections to get through the door. He couldn't pay the price of admission. And I shared with David that the message of Christianity is that what makes us right with God has nothing to do with anything we do or could ever do, but rather with what Jesus has already done once and in full and for all. I tried to explain that if we trust in Jesus Christ, we no longer need to fear judgment because on the cross, Jesus has already taken the judgment for everything we've ever done or ever will do wrong. David called one day and he wanted me to come by his house. The youth were getting ready to leave on a mission trip. We had 2 vans loaded. But knowing his condition, I said, kids, we got to make this stop. David's last request was, come and see me and bring communion. So David talked with the young people. They all came in with me. It was so glad to see him. He talked with young people about his battle and the importance of leaving tobacco alone. And he spoke of God's love. His voice reflected a calmness that I'd never heard in it before. And when it came time to celebrate communion, there in his modest living room, him reclined because he was too weak to stand, David offered the prayer. He spoke of God's love and the meal being evidence that he couldn't earn that love. God's love was a gift. Now, as the kids all filed back to the van to begin our mission adventure, I paused to say to David, I've never seen you so at peace. How are you feeling? And he responded, Preacher, I'm wonderful. I'm actually looking forward to what's next. David was struggling with some of the basic questions about our faith. The truth is, Jesus could have answered our every question about God and life and death and suffering, but he didn't. He could have calmed every storm and prevented his disciples' fear in the first place, but he didn't. He could have held Peter's hand and let him do a little dance across the Sea of Galilee, but he didn't. He didn't make it easy for Peter then. He doesn't make it easy for us now. And there's a reason for that. Faith requires trust, and love requires sacrifice. Every great relationship is built on trust and love. And that's what God wants with us, a relationship. God is doing God's part. God came in the flesh in the person of Jesus Christ to show us the quality of God's life. So now it's our turn to do our part. Every faith journey, no matter how rocky, begins with getting out of the boat and walking toward Jesus. Are you ready to take that step? Even if it's a baby step like Peter's, because Jesus is waiting for you.